think the sad tragedy about countries like Turkey is that oftentimes the people in these countries are far ahead of their governments, and yet they do not have the power to change or challenge those governments. So by looking at those governments, we shouldn't think that the whole country is marked by the same narrative or ideology. Turkey is an interesting case in that regard because it's a very complicated country. And while the government is clearly has been increasingly authoritarian, isolationist, nationalist, Islamist, that is not the case necessarily in the civil society. The civil society, there are many people who are much more progressive, who want a better future for their children, who believe in democracy. So I believe it's incredibly important for people in the West, particularly people who have power, to do two things: to be very critical of human rights violations carried out by politicians and governments in such countries. So not to mince words when it comes to these core values, but at the same time, while we're being critical of the governments in such places, at the same time to connect with the people, with the civil society, and not to forget them, not to isolate them, because that will make a huge difference. Oftentimes, nationalists in countries like Turkey like to claim that the entire Western world is against Turkey. This will also shatter that narrative. It will show people that no, you have sisters and brothers in other parts of the world who care for you. So those connections that go beyond national boundaries have an enormous transformative impact. I think Turkey holds very important lessons for progressive-minded people everywhere, East and West, because what happened there can even happen here. We should not, in my opinion, assume that the world is divided into two categories, like solid lands versus liquid lands. Unfortunately, that was the perception until recently, shared even by many well-educated, well-meaning people. They assumed that in the Western world, democracy was safe. You know, history always moves forward. Tomorrow is going to be much more progressive than yesterday. And because of that assumption, they also thought that you do not have to fight for women's rights or human rights in the Western world. That is not the case. And I believe what happened after the year 2016 is that this dualistic understanding of world geography has been shattered. Now we know that there's no solid lands versus liquid lands. In fact, we're all living in liquid times, as the late Zygmunt Bauman pointed out. So we're all in this together. And even in the developed democracies, time can sometimes go backwards. History doesn't move in a linear way, and generations can make the same mistakes that their grandparents had made. That is why we need to learn from history, but also we need to work for democracy. We can't take it for granted. It's a very fragile, delicate ecosystem, and for that we need to nurture democracy.